Access Fort Wayne offers reflections of our community. Production facilities provided by Access Fort Wayne are a service of the Allen County Public Library. The views and opinions expressed do not necessarily represent those of Access Fort Wayne, the Allen County Public Library, or any other supporting organizations. For more information about creating your own television program with Access Fort Wayne, call 421-1250.
Hello, and welcome to our show, The American Veteran. I'm Dale Parrish, your host, Carl Fowler is co-host, and our guest today is Dr. Alfred Brothers. Dr. Brothers had spent 22 years in the Air Force as a pilot, and I'm sure he has some interesting stories to tell. Welcome to our show, Dr. Brothers.
Well, thank you so very much. I'm very, very happy to be here.
Yeah. You went to ROTC, I understand?
It's interesting. The way I really get involved in flying was initially through Boy Scouts, Air Explorers. And so obviously, we had an Air Explorer post, and I had a chance to have three great advisors. One who's an active duty Air Defense Command pilot, F-106 pilot, who came in on occasion. One was a helicopter pilot, and also one was a private pilot. But again, those are the folks who gave me insight and inspiration about flying airplanes. So from that standpoint. And then after that, obviously I went to Boston Latin School, the oldest public high school in the country, and then went to Boston University in Air Force ROTC. And through Air Force ROTC, I went through the Flight Instruction Program, FIP program, and out at Norwood Airport, had a chance to, again, get my first flights. We got 30 hours. It was a screening program. And it was interesting because my instructor had flown for the RCAF, and he flew in the Battle of Britain. So consequently, again, things tend to go full circle. And then after I graduated from pilot training, I went to Williams Air Force Base, Arizona, again, and to fly the T-37 and T-38. T-37 for 6 months, which was the introductory aircraft, and subsonic. Where the T-38 was a supersonic aircraft, and again, it was designed. Those two airplanes were designed to get us ready to fly any airplane in the inventory. In that context, while I was there, half my class was German, Luftwaffe. And so it's interesting, you're talking about, a little different era, because I went to pilot training in 1964, when obviously World War II was still, in people's minds. And my roommate was German, Luftwaffe. So when I graduated, my parents came down, and his father came down. My father obviously fought in Europe, in Italy, and Germany. So it was a chance, again, for two former adversaries to really sit down and shake hands together. And that was an exciting experience from that standpoint. Also, our wing commander had flown in Britain, in the Battle of Britain, and the German students had a liaison officer, Major Linder, and he also flew. And one of the interesting stories was when we had a chance to get together as a brand new class, those two gentlemen went to the Officers Club bar where everybody meets, and sat down and talked. And they were talking about their experiences, and all of a sudden, it became very, very quiet. Remember I mentioned they both had fought in the Battle of Britain? They realized they had fought against each other.
I'll be doggone.
Taking shots at each other. So again, it was a chance to better understand, what was going on. Again, obviously you get your first airplane out of pilot training, but it's interesting enough because one of the airplanes that came in on an emergency flight was the TFX, which is the forerunner of the F-111. So again, you recognize these two gentlemen were not military pilots because they had beards at that time. One had a white flight suit, one had a black flight suit. And I looked at the airplane and said, I'd love to fly the airplane. Well, I can jump ahead 4 years. I went to fly the 111s in that sense. But again, my first assignment out of pilot training was B-52s, and at Walker Air Force Base, which is in Roswell, New Mexico. And again, I was a young co-pilot at the time, and it was an interesting airplane to learn how to fly. And I think for me, it was a chance for me to really get my feet wet in flying. So again, you have a good senior pilot who's your aircraft commander, and again, who takes good care of you. Right. And then I moved from there because the base was shut down to Minot Air Force Base, North Dakota. So I was only there for 18 months, but then I went to Mount Air Force Base, North Dakota, and again was a young co-pilot. But there, they had an accelerated program. So 2 of us became the youngest aircraft commanders in SAC at that time.
Wasn't that something? Yeah.
Again, and we both went to Southeast Asia, flying B-52s in Southeast Asia. So I was there, for a 6-month tour, flew 68 combat missions. And it was interesting enough because we flew out of Guam, Kadena, which is Okinawa, and also out of Thailand. And again, each time the missions was so much shorter. Out of Guam, the mission was 12 hours long. Out of and you had 1 refueling. Out of Kadena, the mission was 9 hours long. But then out of Thailand, the mission was in fact anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour and a half long.
Yeah.
So again, it gave you a chance to become much more experienced in the airplane that you flew.
Yeah. I didn't even know they had a base in Thailand.
Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes. It was a Royal Thai Air base is what it was. And I'll tell you a little bit later. And I can tell you, I'll just jump ahead. Having been involved with Boy Scouts, I went there for a World Jamboree, the exact same base I was stationed at 20 years later. So I had a chance to look at the area 20 years later with an older set of eyes. I'll use that term. But again, it was great to see the change in the country in that 20-year period of time. Tremendous growth in infrastructure. And
I was going to say they went from things that were very primitive up to more semi-modern, right?
I guess if you remember the James Bond movie that took place in Thailand, I was there in that time frame, and again, if you remember how rustic and rural it looked,
right?
But then go 20 years later, and they have Bangkok's a mega city with fantastic subways and everything else.
They went from ox carts to modern transportation.
So again, it was a chance to see night and day in terms of what had transpired. When I came back from my B-52 assignments, I had volunteered. I'd gotten married in '68 when I was at Minot Air Force Base, and I'd also volunteered again to fly fighters or bombers or whatever in Vietnam. When I came back, I was back about 6 months to a year, and they gave me an assignment back to Southeast Asia, but this time not TDY as I was with the B-52s, but this time for a full year tour. And the airplane was the Canberra. Or the B-57. And again, the training initially was at Hill Air Force Base. So again, my family and I trucked up the Hill Air Force Base in this case it was January. And then the second part of the training was down at MacDill. So you go from winter to summer in that context. And the training was about 6 months long. So I had a chance to, again, to fly an airplane that was very, very different. This was a test airplane. As I mentioned, this airplane had the avionics that was going to go on the F and FB 111s. So again, when we went over there this time, it was to a much smaller squadron. Again, all we had was 18 airplanes that were modified in that situation, and you had roughly 2 pilots. Again, in that situation, it was a pilot and a navigator in that situation, or a radar navigator, and the missions were roughly about an hour and a half long. So again, you'd launch out of Ubon, Thailand, which is almost on the Laos border, up midway through Thailand, and then fly either into Laos or into Vietnam. We didn't go to North Vietnam because the airplane, the nose had been modified so it could accept, again, TV, infrared, and also radar. The original airplane didn't have that. So again, it looked like a chipmunk from up front in that context, and there's a big brake on us. So again, the original top airspeed of the airplane was almost 600 miles an hour. But with that, it was only 380.
Yeah, so again, the wind all the way.
So the role of that airplane, using all that sensor gear, was to go after trucks on the trail.
Oh, okay.
And so again, we were all night attack fighters in that situation, and we were self-fax, meaning we could identify and destroy the targets ourselves.
Yeah, mostly low altitude.
We were flying about 10,000 feet, 8 to 10,000 feet. Reason was we were trying to stay above the 37 millimeter guns, again because of our slow speed in that situation. So we were above the gun.
There were hills there too.
Well, there were hills. You better believe there were hills there too. and unfortunately, most of the hills were made out of karst, which was non-radar reflective. So again, in that same time frame, if you remember, the 111s went over there and many crashed. There were about 10 that crashed because they had radar terrain following equipment, but again, it didn't reflect.
They flew into the ground.
Flew in the ground.
Oh my. Yeah.
So.
Now that wasn't what the Navy flew with the 111s, was it?
No, it did not. No, again, it was designed originally for the Navy, but the basic weight of the airplane was 55,000 pounds, and which was much too heavy that, for in this case for an aircraft carrier, because our takeoff gross weight was about 90,000, which was far exceeded the weight for a carrier.
Yeah.
So again, the great Air Force, in its great wisdom, took the airplane, which was a great airplane because remember it was supersonic. Again, it was our first sweep wing airplane where you can in fact move the wings back. So again, I was there actually 10 months, and then they needed the base because they were going to do major bombing up north, both with B-52s and everything else. So they sent us to the Philippines for a month and then shipped us home. So that's another story about how we came back home with those airplanes. But it was interesting, again, because that's where you really learn to fly an airplane in terms of true combat conditions. A B-52, you're flying at 35,000 feet. But in this case, you're flying at 8 to 10,000 feet, and you are encountering gunfire from the ground. And again, you're your own fact, meaning you find your own targets. And so in that particular area, I was able to normally destroy 1 or 2 trucks, on a mission. But I had one mission in which I destroyed, 9 to 10 trucks, and I received the Distinguished Flying Cross for it because again, the area that was in is the northern part of Laos on the border with North Vietnam. So again, I was honored to receive that particular award. So it's interesting. Again, the people that you run across in that situation, their backgrounds, because we all came from different airplanes. There were very few of us who had flown B-57s before. Most had flown other airplanes. So again, as I say, from the kind of training that we had in pilot training, that was the goal, to ensure that we could transition into any kind of airplane that the Air Force or the military required.
Great, yeah.
So when I came back, I had my assignment to FB-111s, and the base was Pease Air Force Base, New Hampshire. The training was, and my wife had stayed in Boston. I'm originally from Boston with my kids, both her family and my family were there to help her. And Pease Air Force Base is about 65 miles north of Boston.
Okay.
But our training was in New York. It was at Plattsburgh Air Force Base, New York. You remember Plattsburgh?
So you got to go right through Boston.
Oh yeah, in that sense.
That's terrible.
It worked out well. But again, and that was a 6-month program in that sense too. But again, flying the B-57s, which was interesting because, interesting enough because in pilot training, you're trained formation flying. Again, wingtip formation flying. Well, in B-52s, you never expect a B-52 to fly wingtip, and that time it didn't. It flew more like a fingertip. Again, we normally would fly stacked up 500 feet and 1.5 miles back, and then we would spread out so we could drop our bombs. And the bombs were dropped based upon a radar controller on the ground.
Oh, okay.
Or the option was they might have someone on the ground with a beacon that could be picked up on radar, and they did offset bombing on that particular beacon. And we carried 125 500-pound bombs.
How many?
125?
125.
Wow. Jeez.
Well, so then now you go to the B-57, you're carrying 4 laser-guided 500-pound bombs on the wings, and 4 canisters of either napalm or in this case, fire bombs. Again, they explode in the air. Incendiaries, right. So again, a different context.
Okay. Laser guided. It was a smart bomb then.
Those are smart bombs, and it was interesting enough because in that context, we had our own laser, so we could laser a target and then release a weapon, and the weapon would in fact follow it. Yeah. But we also had a sister squadron, AC-130 gunships. They had lasers. And so consequently, if they found something that they couldn't destroy with their guns, they'd call us in, they'd laser it, we'd come in, and then we'd drop the bomb on their laser. So again, it was a hunter-killer concept in that context. So again, they were our sister squadron at Ubon, Thailand. Coming back to 111s, it was interesting enough because we in B-57s had flown close wing formation in training in the whole gamut. And of course, flying 111s, again, we flew wing formation. So again, it was going back to, again, the training that we received in pilot training, everything, actually fell into place.
Sure, you learned the concept.
And it was easy.
Follow it.
And again, it was fun flying the 111s because, again, it had automatic terrain following. So again, the only thing you had to maintain was a throttle speed control because the airplane, obviously, with its navigation gear, could navigate because the route was pre-programmed. And again, using the radar system on board, it would navigate and maintain a particular height off the ground, anything from 200 feet to 1,000 feet. It would do it automatically. But again, it was depending upon radar.
But you didn't have GPS back then, did
No,
you?
did not have GPS, no. Again, you had the inertial navigation system that you had to set.
Okay.
And again, I was an instructor pilot, so I had a chance to fly, you know, and again, you have a pilot and a radar nav, get a chance to fly in the radar nav seat, again, training or evaluating your other pilots.
Okay.
And in this case, we in fact flew at night using that system, and I was a night terrain following instructor. So one of the few instructors who were qualified to teach that at night as far as that goes. So I was there, you know, in that particular time frame, and had gone to things like Red Flag, again at Nellis, where again you had an aggressive squadron that was trained, you know, in allow us to train against them. One of the funny things was, you know, when I went out there the first time, I was flying in a flight of 3, leading a flight of 3. All 3 of us had been in Vietnam, and all 3 of us, you know, had flown fighter attack bombers. And so obviously when they were F-15s that jumped us, all we did was just increase the speed because their altitude, effective altitude, was above 15,000 feet. Ours was close to the ground. So they're going to come after us close to the ground. We could outrun them, run them out of gas.
There you go.
So again, they didn't like us too much from that context. But again, at that time frame, the 111s were brand new in SAC. So again, we helped develop the tactics and the like associated with the FB-111s themselves.
Yeah.
So it's fun to fly a brand new airplane versus the old airplanes.
But you got to learn a lot, don't you?
Always.
It's always a learning curve.
Dramatically so. And again, I do credit the Air Force, and I'll say the military as a whole, for their constant training programs. Again, the idea is to really keep you knowledgeable about not only your airplane, but about all the systems on board and about the tactics. And it's funny, you think about currency, you know, how current are you in an airplane? When I flew B-52s, you know, in the States, you'd fly maybe 4 times a month. When I was in Southeast Asia flying them, the first time you were flying them every 3rd day initially, then every day. Yeah. So in this case, your proficiency grew dramatically, and you began to recognize the difference in your proficiency.
Was it the 111s that you said they lost about 10 of them?
Yes, that's correct.
And it was a new plane.
A new plane at the time, yeah.
What was why did they lose them?
Because of the karst or rock. 2 things happen. Again, in Southeast Asia, the rock is porous and it's non-reflective. So again, if you're using a radar to try to determine your altitude and everything else, again, it doesn't work. It doesn't reflect back. So again, you'd crash into it. It'd be akin to, again, if you're flying at 200 feet automatically, and if there's a 300-foot tree, if there is such a thing, again, you'd never see it. And that was part of the problem.
Okay.
A third problem was again, descending over water. They had no system to really gauge the actual altitude above the water. And a couple of them actually crashed into the water.
So they lost a pilot too then.
In that sense. But again, they later fixed the problem in that sense. They realized what they had to do. But again, they're new airplanes. And again, they hadn't had the chance to run a full gamut of tests or have many years of experience with that airplane. It was a great airplane. Again, it was very, very maneuverable, you know, very, very forgiving. It did carry a good weapon load. And again, it was refueled in midair. So 2 out of the 3 airplanes, we did midair refueling, both the B-52s and the FB-111s. The B-52s, if you, we would take on about 100,000 pounds of fuel launching on a Guam. It takes you about 30 minutes to take on that amount of fuel. So I was one of the few people who had to do it manually. Normally, when the boom goes into a receptacle, there are locks that lock automatically. Well, on my airplane, the locks didn't work. So again, the only way to do it, and we had never done it in training, was again, the boom, remember, is a hydraulic boom. So the boom operator would extend pressure and hold the pressure against the receptacle, and I had to pull back on the airplane to
hold that tight.
Seal. So I stayed on the boom for 30 minutes doing it that way. I was exhausted by the time I got finished with that one. But again, it shows, again, engineering, you can do those kind of things.
30 minutes, you'd travel quite a distance.
Oh, yes.
They didn't teach you that in flight
Didn't teach us that part at that time, yeah.
So that was a fix you came up with, and that would be very difficult because your speeds had to match perfectly.
Well, they did. Again, if you look at a tanker, again, there are a series of lights on the left-hand and right side. One tells you about your spacing, forward and aft relative to that aircraft. The other's up and down. And again, then there's a set of green lights. So if you keep it green, you're in the right position. and you're refueling at 255 knots. So again, you know the speed you're going at.
Yeah, but you're picking up weight as you fly.
Oh, yes, we are.
And he's losing weight as he flies.
So again, you have to increase
So
power.
you both have to adjust.
Yes, we do, very much so. And so again, those tanker crews were outstanding crews as well. And again, another funny story, coming back from Southeast Asia and back to Minot, we came back, in the first couple of months we were back, we had an operational readiness inspection, an ORI. And again, you had to obviously fly a simulated mission out of Minot, typically through Nebraska and the like for low levels, and then back. Well, flying, we ended up encountering, thunderstorms and the like, and the whole gamut. And so the airplanes, all 6 crews had just come back from Vietnam. So again, we're flying in the airplanes and hooking up and again bouncing around in the weather. We go low level, come back, and then we met the Air Force Inspector General at that time. He says, "You guys did good. Guys, this is peacetime. You're not supposed to do that."
Yeah. Okay. All right.
We've not gotten to peacetime mode at this point in time. Yeah. Wartime, we're ready to go.
Yeah. It's what you're used to.
What you're used to, what you're trained for in that situation. Sure. So all of these airplanes were fun to fly. Again, you had a great number of men and women involved. I flew against the first all-female tanker, crew at one time, and again we pulled up 111, and again I knew there were female boom operators. I just had not heard one. All of a sudden you hear a voice. First you hear the nav talk to you, then you hear the co-pilot talk to you, then you hear the boom operator talk to you again. Indicate this must be an all-woman crew, and it was set up that way. But again, a fantastic crew, and again, and many more of those like that as well. So again, I'd gone through that transition where from where all, in this case, crew members were male to where crew members were both male and female in that situation. So it's an interesting time period to see the transition. In this case, in the Air Force, from my experiences at Pease Air Force Base. I then went, as I'm an aeronautical engineer, went to work at the Foreign Technology Division at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. I was initially in the Space Division, working as evaluating space communication systems, satellites, then reconnaissance systems, all different kinds of reconnaissance systems, and then I became branch chief for the missile facilities group there. So again, it was a change to move from flying an airplane, in this case, to working in a different kind of environment. And this case, again, you had a fantastic both civilian and military team doing those kinds of things. So the goal was to provide information upon any enemy system that was out there, so our air crews could, and ground crews, for that matter, could better defend themselves against it.
Yeah, countermeasures.
True. And interesting enough, I was there, then went back to flying again for about a year and a half, and then became the commander of an Air Force ROTC detachment, a brand new one at Wright State University. So again, my career starts obviously through Air Force ROTC, and then I end up, again, eventually, commanding an Air Force ROTC unit. And I grew to be one of the largest units in our area as far as that goes. The only one bigger than mine was Ohio State.
Oh, okay.
And then I went back to Plattsburgh Air Force Base, New York, and I retired out of there. So
retired after how many years?
22.
22 years.
Yeah. You still do a little flying?
I haven't, again, as mentioned, the last 3 years we haven't done much flying because my wife and I like to drive. I'm retired. So, and so she likes to stop. I like to stop too. And of course, if you're flying an airplane, you're not going to stop some of the places she'd like to go in that context. And again, so we now can take our time. It's interesting now that I've retired, you get around a whole host of places. Had a chance in October to visit with my former roommate, my German roommate in Alabama. And as a surprise, we had another one of our German students there with us. So there were 3 old pilots there talking about the good old days and what they had flown.
I had a question for you.
Sure.
And you mentioned that these German pilots was there in Arizona. Now, they was there to learn the planes?
No, they went through pilot training just like we did. They went through...
well, they're capable of learning that in Germany, aren't they?
What happened was they come here to fly 104s. At the time, so that they went through our pilot training, and then went to Luke, which is north of Phoenix, to learn how to fly F-104s.
Okay, so they learn to be pilots first, and then they checked out 104s and fly 104s.
And so they went back to Germany to fly 104s. So we were mad at them because I got my B-52s and my roommate got his 104s.
Yeah, but you wanted to be the 104 guy. Everybody wants to be a fighter pilot.
Of
right?
course.
Yeah, okay.
It's interesting because at our guest speaker at our graduation was Chappie James, who was a colonel at the time.
Right.
So again, you get to meet people in many different areas.
Okay.
You know, in documentaries and movies, you see that there are planes making a bombing run, first one, second one. Are they talking to one another all this time?
Probably not. The reason why you want to be radio silent, because remember your enemy is actually picking up. So your tactics are pre-planned. Yeah. Like for us in B-52s, when we went over, obviously this case there was some ground communication, but after that it ceased, and then our particular nav team took over as far as that goes. So again, for the most part, you're radio silent. Once we launched out of Guam, we were radio silent until we were picked up crossing the area in Southeast Asia, and then we only communicating for a short period of time to find out what the target was, yeah. and then radio silent again.
Yeah, okay. You know, in Vietnam, you hear more about the Navy making bombing runs than you do the Air Force.
Well, that's not necessarily true.
No?
No, the Navy come in off of carriers.
Yeah.
Basically, and the Air Force was running the B-52 program there for quite some years, and that. Yeah. As far as fighter pilots, you had the F-4s, right?
The Air Force had Air Force, the Phantom primarily. All right, that's exactly right.
And so they flew those pretty much.
And both of them did, both the Navy and the Air Force flew in that sense.
Yeah, yeah.
So, and really the flying environment we're a little different in that context, because again I went back to a different base, in that case in B-52s, where in B-57s I went back to a base in Thailand. So again, where our Navy guys were actually off the coast of Vietnam.
Yeah, they was flying in and basically hitting ground targets, whereas the Air Force was hunting MiGs.
Okay.
They were fighters.
The MiG killers, that's true.
Yeah.
When did the B-52s come in? When they first start using the 52s?
Over there, let's see, that would have been 67, I believe. I'm sorry, no, it would have been later. Let's see, I'm just trying to think when I went over there. It would have been about 68.
Oh,
68.
Okay. I was thinking a little earlier than that.
But again, that's when the rotation started. Where people from each base were sent, crews from each base were sent over to fly the B-52s, and there was a transition period. Since I flew the newest model, the H model, I had to go to Castle Air Force Base for about a 3-week period of time to relearn how to fly the D model, the older model airplane.
I see.
The later model airplane had turbofan engines, and so where the older models had water injection for takeoff. So again, there was a different in characteristics in terms of takeoff and the like associated with it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, you've had a very interesting career.
It's been very interesting in that context.
Yes.
Now, you say you flew the F-111?
Right.
That would be this plane.
No, there would be the other one. That's the B-57.
That's B-57. Oh, you're right.
And you notice,
and
if you notice that particular airplane, it's got wing tanks on them, and those are fuel tanks. So again,
long range.
Long range. Again, it had the capability to go in an extended range, and you drop the tanks. Obviously once they became empty.
Okay, tanks are inexpensive.
No, again, inexpensive in that context. But the goal was you then pick up speed because you can't fly supersonic with the tanks.
Yeah.
Okay. And the airplane would fly almost Mach 2 in that case.
I'm sorry, we're out of time.
Okay.
Thank you for being on our show.
We're very happy to be here.
Thank you.
Brothers.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, thank you for watching our show, and remember, freedom is not free. Dr. Brothers is going to be back with us for another show about Black history, so be sure to tune in. Thank you, and good night.